The headline suggests a familiar conflict, a mainstream press apparatus attempting once again to smother an inconvenient development before it reaches public consciousness. It sounds almost routine, as though this were simply another episode in the long and predictable cycle of selective reporting. But it is actually worse than that, because this time the attempted burial did not merely obscure information, it exposed the very mechanisms used to suppress it. The haste, the omissions, the carefully synchronized commentary across outlets. These did not conceal the story. They revealed the growing desperation behind the effort. And yet the public is being told that nothing unusual has occurred, that the silence is normal, and that the absence of coverage is a sign of insignificance rather than deliberate omission. It is a misdirection the media still assumes will work. And that's where this story actually begins. The event itself, the one quietly pushed aside, did not disappear because it lacked relevance. It disappeared because it contradicted a narrative scaffolded over months, built through repetition rather than evidence, and sustained by the confidence that the press still possesses its old gatekeeping power. The incident was not merely inconvenient, it was clarifying. It revealed intent behind earlier statements that had been portrayed as spontaneous. It demonstrated coordination among individuals who had insisted their actions were isolated. And it suggested preparation, not in the sense of planning an outcome, but of preparing an audience to accept a particular interpretation long before facts were available. The official narrative, when dismantled slowly, reveals its true purpose: to condition the public to view certain behaviors as normal, certain inconsistencies as harmless, and certain abuses as justified by the moment. The silence was not passive. It was tactical. It was designed to blunt the impact of a story that would otherwise force a reconsideration of prior assurances. And it relied, as so many modern narratives do, on the assumption that if the press does not amplify a revelation, the revelation lacks legitimacy. But coordination leaves fingerprints, and this time they were too visible to hide. There comes a moment when political maneuvering collides with institutional responsibility. And despite the modern impulse to treat every dispute as a partisan contest, this episode crosses into something more fundamental. This is where lines matter, not lines between parties, but lines between branches, between oversight and overreach, between lawful authority and political improvisation. At some point, institutions must respond. When an event challenges not merely a talking point, but the integrity of a process, whether judicial, administrative, or procedural, silence becomes untenable. A constitutional framework does not function if the guardians of that framework permit its slow erosion out of convenience. This is not theoretical. When precedents are ignored, chains of command blurred, and the public conditioned to accept these degradations as the cost of political urgency, the system itself becomes unmoored. The attempted media burial obscured the severity of this breach, but institutions that operate on mandates rather than narratives cannot simply look away, and so a line long thought irrelevant suddenly reasserted itself. The most striking development was not public outrage, nor partisan reaction, but the backlash that landed upon someone who had assumed insulation. The individual at the center of this episode was not an outsider. They were a person whose credentials had long insulated them from scrutiny, a senior figure, respected by allies, treated by commentators as too established to fall under suspicion. And it was precisely that standing that made the blowback so severe. For years their rank served as a shield, now it serves as a spotlight. Institutions expect more from such individuals, not less. And when someone with experience, with tenure, with procedural knowledge crosses a boundary, the infraction is not softened, it is magnified. What the media sought to bury quickly resurfaced because institutions recognized that allowing a privileged figure to bypass accountability would send the wrong signal, a signal suggesting rules apply only when politically convenient. The transition from quiet media suppression to formal institutional action was not an escalation. It was inevitability. When statements finally emerged from official spokespeople or procedural offices responsible for oversight, the language was unmistakably firm. Not dramatic, not accusatory, simply precise. References to breach of protocol, misrepresentation of process, and departure from established norms appeared without emotional embellishment. Bureaucratic phrasing, yes, but phrasing with consequences. The power dynamic shifted subtly but definitively. Where media had attempted to frame the episode as irrelevant or misunderstood, institutional language made clear that rules had indeed been broken, and that the breach could not remain unaddressed. Emotional framing evaporates when placed beside the cold grammar of institutional responsibility, and in that contrast one sees the real significance of this moment. A narrative does not withstand the weight of a record. The public reaction from the individual involved provided further clarity. A sudden flurry of defensive posts, appeals to personal integrity, and lengthy references to past service began to appear. It was resume shielding, the invocation of credentials as a substitute for explanation. The tone shifted rapidly from confidence to insistence, from authority to self-vindication. Statements became longer, more emotional, more self-referential. None addressed the procedural issue that institutions had identified. Fear rarely announces itself directly. It manifests in excessive verbiage, in appeals to reputation, in rhetorical inflation designed to mask a lack of substantive defense. The public saw these signals. Institutions certainly did, and no degree of self-praise can undo a breach of process. Meanwhile, friendly outlets attempted to revive the initial burial. They reframed the incident as a misunderstanding, cast the subject as overwhelmed or unfairly targeted, and leaned heavily on sympathy over scrutiny. Emotion replaced evidence, intent replaced action, context replaced accountability. This pattern is now familiar. When facts threaten a narrative, the media shifts from analysis to effect. Yet this time the tactic fell flat because institutional responses had already entered the record. Sympathy cannot erase documentation, and the public, increasingly skeptical of curated outrage, recognized the disconnect. In trying to bury the story, the media inadvertently confirmed its importance. This episode belongs to a broader landscape that has taken shape over years, a landscape marked by institutional decay, by the quiet normalization of exceptionalism among the political class, by a media apparatus that protects allies and misconstrues accountability as persecution. We have seen these patterns before, in intelligence briefings selectively leaked to advance a narrative, in legal processes reshaped to justify predetermined outcomes, in bureaucratic decisions framed as emergency exceptions to avoid public scrutiny. Each time the assumption is that the press will manage perception, smoothing the rough edges and redirecting attention. But this moment feels different, not because of its content, but because of its timing. Institutions that once tolerated these behaviors now show signs of fatigue. The public that once deferred to narrative framing now demands transparency. And the media, confident in its old authority, finds its attempts at burial counterproductive. The ground is shifting. The question now is not whether the story will survive the news cycle. It already has. The real question is whether this marks a turning point in institutional patience, whether the guardians of process will continue reasserting boundaries, or whether this was merely an isolated correction. If institutions are reclaiming lost authority, political actors, accustomed to narrative immunity, may soon find themselves constrained by rules they once regarded as optional. And if they are not, the erosion we are witnessing will accelerate. This is the fork in the road. In the end, the attempt to bury the story accomplished the opposite of its intent. Had it been reported plainly, it might have passed with modest attention, but the coordinated silence, the abrupt reframing, and the visible defensiveness from those involved only magnified its importance. A narrative constructed to obscure misconduct instead revealed the tools of obscurity. The irony is unmistakable. The very effort to suppress the truth became the evidence of why the truth mattered. And as institutions quietly reassert themselves, the lesson grows clear. Even in an age of managed perception, certain facts resist burial. And this moment, quietly but unmistakably, suggests that resistance is growing. The warning remains unresolved. When truth must be hidden to preserve power, the exposure of that hiding becomes the most dangerous revelation of all.